Airport security humiliated the old man. Then Flight 447 started going down, sir. You need to step aside. You're holding up the line. The TSA agent's voice dripped with irritation as he watched the elderly man struggle to remove his worn shoes at the security checkpoint. Other passengers sighed and checked their phones impatiently while the old man fumbled with his belt. "Maybe you should have left earlier, Grandpa," muttered a businessman behind him. But 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, when Flight 447's engines failed and the pilots panicked, that same slow old man would become the only person capable of saving 247 lives. The departure terminal at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Flight 447 to London Heathrow was running slightly behind schedule, and the gate area was packed with impatient passengers checking their watches and phones. Among them sat Captain Richard Stone, a 34-year veteran pilot for Atlantic Airways, reviewing his flight plan one final time. At 67 years old, Stone looked every bit his age. His hair had gone completely silver, deep lines creased his weathered face, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had accumulated decades of wear. Stone had been flying commercial aircraft since 1989, accumulating over 25,000 flight hours and an impeccable safety record. But the younger crew members and passengers saw only what was visible on the surface, an old man who seemed to belong more in a retirement home than in a cockpit. The pre-flight security screening had been particularly humiliating. TSA agent Rodriguez, barely 25 years old, had treated Stone like any other potentially troublesome elderly passenger. "Arms up, sir," Rodriguez had commanded with barely concealed impatience as Stone moved slowly through the body scanner. "Sir, the machine is beeping. Do you have anything in your pockets?" "Just my reading glasses and a pen," Stone had replied quietly. "We'll take them out. You should know the rules by now." Other passengers in line behind Stone had begun to grumble. A young woman in business attire tapped her foot aggressively. "Come on, some of us have connections to make," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Stone had apologized softly and tried to move faster, but his arthritis made quick movements difficult. The secondary screening had been worse. Rodriguez had been thorough to the point of harassment, seeming to take particular pleasure in making the old pilot remove his belt, his shoes, and even his captain's jacket for additional inspection. "What's this?" Rodriguez had asked, holding up Stone's flight bag. "Navigation charts and flight computers," Stone had explained. "I'm the captain of Flight 447. Rodriguez had given him a skeptical look. "Sure you are, Pops. And I'm Chuck Yeager." The mocking laughter from other passengers still rang in Stone's ears as he finally made it to his gate. Now, sitting in the gate area, Stone tried to focus on his pre-flight preparations. But the whispered comments from nearby passengers were hard to ignore. "Did you see how long that old guy took at security?" one woman was saying to her companion. "I hope he's not on our flight." "Probably flying standby with some senior discount," her friend replied with a snicker. "Airlines should have age limits for passengers. Some of these old folks can barely walk, let alone handle an emergency evacuation." Stone's co-pilot, First Officer Jennifer Hayes, approached with their flight documents. At 31, Hayes was sharp, ambitious, and barely concealed her frustration at being paired with such an elderly captain. "Captain Stone," she said formally, "I've completed the pre-flight checklist. Weather looks challenging over the Atlantic. We're expecting significant turbulence and possible wind shear." Stone reviewed the weather reports with the experience of someone who had flown through countless storms. We'll monitor conditions closely and request altitude changes as needed, he replied. Hayes rolled her eyes slightly when she thought he wasn't looking. To her, Stone represented the old guard, cautious, conservative, and probably past his prime. As passengers began boarding, Stone made his way to the aircraft. The gate agent, a young man named Marcus, barely looked up from his computer as the captain passed. "Excuse me," Stone said politely. "I need to get to the cockpit." Marcus glanced up with mild annoyance. "Passengers board by groups. Please wait for your zone to be called." "I'm Captain Stone, the pilot of this aircraft." Marcus looked at him skeptically, taking in Stone's aged appearance and slow movements. "Do you have ID?" Stone produced his pilot credentials, which Marcus examined with exaggerated thoroughness. "Okay, but next time wear your uniform jacket so I can see your stripes," Marcus said dismissively. The boarding process revealed more of the same attitude. Flight attendant Sarah Chen, though professional, couldn't hide her concern about having such an elderly captain. During the crew briefing, she whispered to her colleague, "Do you think he's really up for a transatlantic flight? He seems pretty frail." The sentiment was echoed by passengers who caught glimpses of Stone in the cockpit. "That pilot looks ancient," one passenger texted to a friend. "Pray for me on this flight." Another took a photo through the cockpit door and posted it on social media with the caption, "When your pilot looks older than the plane itself." Flight 447 pushed back from the gate exactly on schedule despite the earlier delays. Stone's taxi and takeoff were textbook perfect, smooth and professional. But passengers who had been complaining about his age during boarding now found new reasons to criticize. "Did you feel how hard he hit the runway on takeoff?" one man complained to his wife, despite the fact that the takeoff had been flawlessly executed. "I bet he can't even see the instruments properly at his age," another passenger speculated loudly enough for others to hear. As Flight 447 climbed through 35,000 feet over the Atlantic, the passengers settled into their routines, watching movies, reading, sleeping. In the cockpit, Stone and Hayes monitored their instruments and communicated with air traffic control. The flight was proceeding normally until they were approximately 800 miles east of Newfoundland. That's when everything changed. First Officer Hayes was reviewing their fuel calculations when she noticed an anomaly in the engine readings. "Captain, I'm seeing some fluctuations in Engine 2, she reported, her voice tight with concern. Stone immediately focused on his instruments. The engine parameters were indeed showing irregular readings, temperature spikes, pressure variations, and power output fluctuations that shouldn't be happening in a properly functioning engine. "Let's run through the troubleshooting checklist," Stone said calmly, his decades of experience taking over. But before they could begin their diagnostics, the situation became much worse. A loud bang echoed through the aircraft, followed by violent shaking that threw passengers against their seats. Emergency lights began flashing throughout the cabin as Flight 447's second engine suffered a catastrophic failure. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Atlantic 447. Hayes transmitted immediately. "We have an engine failure and are declaring an emergency." The response from air traffic control was swift. "Atlantic 447, we copy your Mayday. What is your current situation and intentions?" In the cockpit, alarms were sounding as Stone worked to stabilize the aircraft. Flying on one engine over the Atlantic was serious enough, but what happened next pushed them into genuine crisis territory. Engine number 1, stressed by having to carry the full load, began showing signs of impending failure as well. Captain, Engine 1 is overheating, Hayes reported, her voice now showing clear signs of panic. Oil pressure is dropping, and we're losing power. Stone's hands moved over the controls with practiced precision, adjusting power settings, monitoring temperatures, calculating fuel consumption, and drift rates. We need to find the nearest airport and get this bird on the ground, he said, with the calm that only comes from having faced similar emergencies before. But Hayes, despite her training, was beginning to lose her composure as the situation deteriorated. The passenger cabin had erupted in barely controlled panic as the aircraft shuddered and the lights flickered. The same passengers who had mocked Stone's age during boarding were now praying that the old pilot could somehow save them. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, trying to maintain order and prepare passengers for what might be an emergency landing, or worse. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain." Stone's voice came over the intercom, calm and reassuring despite the crisis. "We are experiencing some mechanical difficulties and will be diverting to the nearest suitable airport. Please remain seated and follow the instructions of our flight attendants." But privately, in the cockpit, Stone knew they were in serious trouble. Both engines were failing, they were hundreds of miles from the nearest airport, and they were rapidly losing altitude. First Officer Hayes was consulting emergency procedures, but her hands were shaking as she tried to locate the right checklists. "What do we do?" she asked, the question coming out more like a plea than a professional inquiry. Stone looked at his instruments, calculated their position, and drew on every bit of knowledge accumulated over 34 years of flying. "So, we're going to do something that's not in any manual," Stone said quietly. "If you're enjoying this incredible story of how experience trumps youth in crisis situations, make sure to subscribe for more amazing veteran stories like this one." What Stone did next would be talked about in aviation circles for decades to come. Using a combination of techniques learned from military training, decades of experience with engine failures, and an intimate understanding of aircraft aerodynamics, he began to nurse the failing aircraft toward a small military airfield in Greenland. The approach required flying the aircraft in a way that pushed every system to its limits, while staying within the narrow margin of safety that would keep them airborne. Stone had to balance airspeed, altitude, and power settings with the precision of a master craftsman, all while dealing with increasingly unreliable engines and deteriorating weather conditions. First Officer Hayes watched in amazement as the elderly captain she had dismissed as past his prime demonstrated flying skills that bordered on the impossible. "How are you doing that?" she asked, as Stone managed to coax more performance from the failing engines than should have been possible. 43 years of flying," Stone replied, his hands never leaving the controls. 34 commercial, 9 military before that. You learn things in emergencies that you can't get from a textbook. The aircraft was still losing altitude, but now they were approaching the Greenland coast. The military airfield Stone had targeted was small, with a short runway and limited facilities, but it was their only hope. As Flight 447 made its final approach, the passengers could see the barren landscape of Greenland rushing up to meet them. Many were certain they were about to die. The aircraft was flying at an impossibly steep angle, engines sputtering and failing, but somehow still airborne thanks to Stone's masterful handling. The landing was unlike anything in commercial aviation textbooks, more like a controlled crash than a normal touchdown. But it worked. Flight 447 hit the runway hard, bounced once, then settled onto the tarmac as Stone deployed every available brake and drag device to bring the aircraft to a stop. When the aircraft finally came to rest, The silence in the cabin was deafening. Then, slowly, passengers began to realize they were alive. They were safe. They had survived what should have been an unsurvivable emergency, thanks to the skill of the old pilot they had mocked and dismissed. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within minutes, but there were no serious injuries among the 247 souls on board. As passengers evacuated down emergency slides, many of them looked back at the cockpit, where Captain Stone was completing his post-emergency checklists with the same methodical care he had shown throughout the crisis. The businessman who had called him Grandpa at security was among the first to seek him out. "Captain," the man said, tears in his eyes, "I owe you an apology. And my life." The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what Stone had accomplished. Both engines had suffered failures that should have made continued flight impossible. The fact that he had managed to keep the aircraft airborne for over an hour and successfully land it was being called miraculous by aviation experts. "In 50 years of investigating aircraft accidents," said NTSB investigator Patricia Williams, "I have never seen a more masterful display of airmanship under impossible conditions." First Officer Hayes, humbled by witnessing Stone's performance under pressure, became his most vocal advocate. "I thought his age made him a liability," she admitted to investigators. "I couldn't have been more wrong. His experience saved every life on that aircraft." The passengers who had complained about Stone's age during boarding now told a very different story. Social media posts that had mocked the ancient pilot were deleted and replaced with messages of gratitude and respect. TSA agent Rodriguez, who had harassed Stone during security screening, watched the news coverage of Flight 447 with growing shame. The slow old man he had humiliated and mocked had just performed one of the most remarkable feats in aviation history. The next time Rodriguez saw an elderly passenger struggling at his checkpoint, he offered help instead of impatience. The airline industry took notice as well. Captain Stone's emergency landing became a case study in aviation schools around the world, demonstrating the irreplaceable value of experience in crisis situations. Atlantic Airways offered Stone a commendation and the option to continue flying until the mandatory retirement age of 70. But Stone, perhaps feeling that he had made his point, chose to retire quietly. His final flight was a routine domestic route, but the gate areas and airport corridors were lined with airline employees, passengers, and aviation enthusiasts who wanted to pay their respects to a true professional. Flying was never about the recognition, Stone told reporters at his retirement ceremony. It was about getting passengers safely from point A to point B. That's what we do, regardless of our age. The lesson of Flight 447 resonated far beyond the aviation industry. It became a powerful reminder that experience and wisdom cannot be replaced by youth and technology alone. Captain Richard Stone had faced the ultimate test of his abilities at an age when many people considered him too old to be effective. His response had been nothing short of extraordinary. The same passengers who had questioned whether an elderly pilot should be flying were now alive because of his skill, experience, and unshakable professionalism. Today, a model of Flight 447 sits in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, with a plaque that reads, "In recognition of Captain Richard Stone, whose skill and experience under impossible conditions saved 247 lives and demonstrated that true expertise comes not from youth, but from decades of dedication to excellence." Stone never asked for the recognition, but the aviation community insisted that his story be preserved as an inspiration for future generations of pilots. The old man who struggled to get through airport security, who was mocked for his age and dismissed as past his prime, had proven that sometimes the most important qualifications can't be seen from the outside. They're carried in the mind and hands of someone who has spent a lifetime mastering their craft. Captain Richard Stone's legacy serves as a reminder that wisdom earned through decades of experience is one of humanity's most precious resources and should never be underestimated or dismissed because of something as superficial as age.